Can we go past the wonderful gift of Mother Nature? The thousand blended notes so melodious, the beautiful cascade, the exuberance of the forest, the luscious fruits we enjoy, and many more. It's no wonder William Wordsworth adorned nature. Very good afternoon, everyone. Respected Chairman of Indian Academy Education Trust, Dr. T. Somshekhar, Secretary Mrs. Bharti, Chief Operating Officer of Indian Academy Group of Institutions, Dr. Srinidhi K. Parthasarthi, Principal of Indian Academy Degree College Autonomous, Dr. E. Jerome Xavier, the guest speakers of the day, Dr. Upma Mandral and Ms. Alolika Sinha, faculty members, research scholars, and students, hearty welcome to all to this webinar series with the theme Women in Nature Conservation, organized by Department of Zoology in collaboration with Nature Club of IATCA. If you truly love nature, you will find beauty everywhere. As humans, our task must be to free ourselves by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all the living creatures and the whole of nature and its beauty. By conserving wildlife, we are ensuring that the future generations can enjoy our natural world and the incredible species that live within it. Nature conservation is the need of the hour. I now invite our beloved principal, Dr. E. Jerome Xavier, to introduce and welcome the first speaker of the day, Dr. Upma Mandral.
Dear participants, in that short 2 minutes of introduction on the theme of the webinar, Professor Sangeeta so poetically shared with us her thoughts on the conservation of nature. And it is very interesting to see that women are getting involved more and more in conservation of nature. Over the last quarter century, we know that all of us human beings, scientists, politicians, everyone in the universe, particularly planet Earth, are worried about the ecological imbalance that is taking place. Therefore, in this context, the preservation and conservation of nature has taken prominence and attracted particularly the scientific community. I'm glad to introduce one of the resource persons of this webinar who will share her personal experience. Dr. Upma Mandral, who is a project scientist at Wildlife Institute of India, has completed her PhD from the same institute and has almost 10 years of experience in conducting ecological and social surveys, which includes to assess habitat, bird and mammal diversity in terrestrial and wetland ecosystem that helped in taking management decisions. She has documented human-wildlife conflict mitigation in India. She has also worked in different protected area landscapes in India, primarily with local communities dependent on natural resources for their livelihood security. Dr. Upma has the experience of teaching, conducting workshops, and participatory trainings for a variety of audience, ranging from postgraduate students to forest department officials and trainees. She has received a few international research and travel grants, including Ruford Small Grant and CLP Future Conservationist Award. Certainly, it is a privilege and honor to have a person who has personal experience and who is authentic when she shares her information, primarily based on her personal experience and commitment. Unless you are committed to Mother Nature, you will not be involved and give your heart and soul into such a kind of project. Therefore, Dr. Upma, we are delighted and happy and honored to have you this afternoon, and we await to hear from you all your personal experiences, which would hopefully help each one of us to work towards conservation of nature. Over to Dr. Upma.
Thank you very much, sir. Good afternoon to everyone present, and I would like to thank you very much for the introduction and having me here.
Yes, ma'am, go ahead, we could hear.
Yes. I'll start with my presentation. Yes, so I hope everybody can see the first slide here. I'll be talking about human dimensions in wildlife conservation, mainly in India. What are the major challenges? What are the major issues? And what are few success stories or solutions? So as a young student or, as a youth, whenever we think about wildlife conservation or wildlife research, we think about majestic species such as tiger, we think about elephant, we think about elusive species such as barking deer, or beautiful birds, gharial species like, or maybe butterflies or marine species. Sometimes we also think about working in habitats, wetland, forest, or we think about anthropogenic pressure, various threats that are posed due to human activities to the wildlife conservation. However, one very important and very crucial aspect is understanding the perception, belief system of people. If you look at this photo here, you can see various kind of interactions between people and wildlife, both positive and negative. Now, people are dependent on various resources that we get from forest, that we get from wetland or river ecosystems. There are aesthetic values, but then there are conflict situations where, the humans are killed, or there are some accidental attacks. There are crop foraging by wildlife species. Thus, it becomes very important to understand various human aspects of wildlife conservation. So I have worked for almost 10 years now in different ecosystems. I've worked in Himalayan forest. I have worked in Tarai art landscape in Uttarakhand and Uttar Pradesh. I have worked in projects that assisted habitat of riverbed mining sites. And I would, through this presentation, I'll be talking about all these issues, and I'll also talk about the general aspects of those issues. So if we look at the global ecosystem, a healthy society and a developed strong economy depend on a healthy environment. We need to understand various ecological processes. We need to understand resource extraction, and we need to ensure that we don't degrade system so much that at the end well-being of people is affected negatively. Thus, it is said that healthy ecosystems and community well-being are interdependent. There are various ecosystem services. There was this Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that was conducted by various global experts, and then they categorize various ecosystem services into 4 categories. Provisioning services that involve goods that are directly extracted from the natural system, food, fresh water, fuel wood. Then there are regulating and supporting services like nutrient cycling, Then various component, abiotic or biotic component of ecosystem, they provide these services, whether it's nutrient cycling or there are climate regulation by forests, there are flood regulation by forest or by wetlands, and then there are cultural services, various indigenous communities or local communities, they have some cultural aspect attached to natural resources. So all these components, all these services contribute to well-being of people globally, regionally, or within a site or a village. Now you get security, personal safety is there. Then there are basic materials for good life. There is good health. And at the end, there is a freedom of choice and action. If you have resources, you can choose to live your life in a certain way. So when it comes to human dimension, it is a mix of natural or biological science and social science. You need to understand how do local communities or various stakeholders value wildlife, what are the benefits that they extract or they desire to get. Then what is the acceptability of management practice if there is some management decision taken by authorities, whether people agree with it or they oppose it, how various stakeholders affect or are affected by wildlife actions. Now, there is this quote, there is this very important, or it's actually one of my favorite quotes whenever I talk about human dimension, that says that conservation is primarily not about biology, but about people and the choices they make. You can understand, you need to understand, various processes. You need to understand species, you need to study their population, you need to study their habitat. But at the end, you need to understand how people perceive wildlife, how people perceive various management decisions, and what are the choices that they make, whether they want to conserve it, whether they want to extract it in a sustainable way, or whether they want to extract just only for their personal gains. Now, failing to understand the position and address the concerns of public might lead to unsupported decisions, and people might oppose wildlife conservation efforts within a landscape. So now management application of human dimension is interlinked with social psychology and wildlife related activities, whether it's consumptive values or whether it's aesthetic values. Now everything depends on how people see the wildlife and how people see the natural system. Now all this research leads to incorporating this insight into management applications, into wildlife policies and management practices. Even if you want to start a conservation campaign or education effort, you want to launch a communication strategy in an area, you need to first understand what people think and how much effort you need to put into maybe bringing some changes in conservation behavior. Now this is a site from Himalaya, and in case of in India, in many developing nations, just like our country, people are situated, or all these human settlements are located amid some natural system, either along a water body, along a river, or there are coastal communities, or people are dependent on natural resources from forest. Many villages, now a large proportion of human population in India live in villages, and these rural communities are dependent on natural resources for their day-to-day sustenance. Not only income generation, for their their daily consumption also, they are highly dependent on these resources. They get fodder, they get fuel wood. Now there was a study from Western Himalaya, from Uttarakhand, and the worker, they said that for sustaining 1 hectare of agriculture field, you need 7 hectares of Banj oak forest. It's Quercus leucotrichophoria, and the species is called lifeline for communities. Now, when people extract resources, there could be encounters with wildlife. There could be degradation of forest if the resource extraction is unregulated. So while people extract all these resources, they might come into some conflict with various wild species. Now, if you look at this rural system, there is a flow of resources from natural system. There is this globally accepted sustainable livelihood framework, which has 5 components. Now, second component talks about the livelihood pentagon. If you talk about livelihood of people, it's not only the money part, it's not only the monetary, the income part, but there are various other aspects attached to it. What are the activities that a household or that an individual do to sustain itself is part of livelihood. So you might not be selling fuel wood from forest, but you are using that fuel wood for sustaining your family. That is part of livelihood. So we have this livelihood pentagon that talks about 5 important capitals. Human capital, which is how many family members are there, which can contribute to livelihood, and also various skills that people have. There is physical capital. You need to travel from one place to another. Maybe you need better road to travel to your workplace, or even in a rural system, you need land holdings to sustain agriculture. Then there are financial capital. There are social capital, how people help each other. And then the most important in case of rural community is natural capital. We have forest dependent communities, forest dwelling communities across India. In almost all the biogeographic zone, there are people who are dependent on natural resources for sustaining their livelihood. Now, if you look at this picture, this is from Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary. It's a Himalayan protected area in Uttarakhand. Now, there is a village in the middle, which is dependent on 3 kind of natural system or 3 kind of system for sustaining themselves. Now, they are dependent on forest, which comes under forest department. Now, it could be Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary forest, or it could be some reserve forest. Then there are community managed land or community managed forest, where village council comes in play. And then there are agroforestry systems. Now, people are dependent on these resources, on this system during different parts of year. Now, not everything is rosy when it comes to interaction of people and natural system. There are many negative interactions. There are ways where people affect wildlife. There is overuse of forest resources, encroachments, illegal tree cutting, poaching, retaliatory killing. When, in many communities where wildlife is attacking livestock or foraging on crops and all, people retaliate in some way. There are incidents of poisoning of kill, so that when the tiger or leopard comes, they eat the poisoned carcass, and then there is a negative result. There are cases of persecuting wild dogs by people, or of Indian fox or Indian wolves by people, because they fear that they might attack their livestock, or they are actually attacking livestock. So that retaliatory killing is there. Then there are grazing in natural habitats. There was this study from Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary where they looked at habitat use overlap between wildlife and livestock, and they found that species like Himalayan tahr, they are displaced by livestock in alpine meadows during summer months, when people take their livestock, people take their animals to graze in alpine meadows, and these species, they come back to those areas only during winters when there is no human disturbance. So at the end, there is this overall habitat degradation. Now, there are ways where wildlife affects people. There is crop damage, human killing, stock lifting. And then there is one kind of conflict where conflict is between people. It could be between local communities and forest department. It could be between the forest department that wants to protect forests and the development agencies. Then the conflict could be between the authorities and local community-based institutions such as one panchayat or a gram panchayat. So these are few pictures of human-wildlife conflict that I took in my study area. Now this person was attacked by an Asian black bear. Now He couldn't work for a few days. He had to spend money on his treatment, and then he was awaiting ex-gratia. There is this woman standing in her field, which was mauled by wild pig the previous night. There is this cattle that was killed during the previous evening, just outside the village. And then there are troops of rhesus macaque which feed on wheat and mustard seeds. Now all these activities, all these negative interactions, they have different, the degree of impact on people is different. For example, for a family that has only one livestock, the damage to that one livestock, that loss of that one livestock might be bigger than a family that have 10 livestock and then one animal is killed. So how do they perceive wildlife differs how people are affected by such interactions. So this is this is the various constituent of well-being that I had shown earlier also in that ecosystem slide. Now, because of human-wildlife conflict, there are direct impacts, loss of life or injury, or loss of crop and livestock, various assets. But then there are hidden impacts also. There are opportunity costs, there are transaction costs. You have to pay your, you have to pay for your medical treatment, and ex-gratia is generally not provided at that very moment. So you have to wait for it. Then there are opportunity costs. At times, if you are growing 100 kg of potato and you just need 50 for your family, rest 50 you can sell and have some surplus income. But then 40 kg is lost by wildlife, then that cost is there where you are losing on that income. There are psychological costs. There are some studies from Assam and Sundarbans, and their workers found that women whose husbands were killed by elephants, they tend to be detached from their family. There was this one woman who stopped caring for her children completely. Then there are other costs, psychological costs. For example, you don't have that freedom of choice. If there is a tiger or leopard outside, if you have, somebody has sighted a leopard or a tiger near the village, then people tend to avoid going out during dark. So that freedom of choice is left. So there is this actual and perceived conflict, and perceived conflict is a result of psychological costs, because people perceive that there is a conflict. There might not be, but then, if you see a carnivore species like tiger or leopard outside, or maybe bear, you will be more careful. So you might limit your movement alone in certain areas. So all these costs affect well-being of people. Now, if you look at the extent of human-wildlife conflict in India, there were more than 78,000 cases of human-wildlife conflict in 17 Indian states in 1 year. Of these, around 46 humans lost their life in due to human-elephant conflict. And there are certain states such as West Bengal, Odisha, Assam, where more than 500 people lost their lives in last 10 years due to human-elephant conflict. There are leopard attacks in many states. Most of the time, these attacks are accidental. It's not that an elephant wants to come and kill you, but then there are accidental encounters, and people lose their life or get injured due to that. Now, in case of Uttarakhand, which is a very small state, there were 285. There were more than 1,000 incidents of leopard attack, where 285 people lost their life and 952 were injured in around 16 years. In a small district called Pauri, 400 livestock were killed in just 2 years. So then there is crop and property damage. So government, they pay ex gratia to people, and it's like a burden on the government also, on the authorities also. So due to crop and property damage because of elephants, in 10 years, government paid, many state governments, they paid more than almost 40 lakh rupees in compensation. That is a huge amount, and that is like a burden on authorities. So what are the mitigation strategies? Now, first and foremost is working with people. Now, because communities, they tend to outlast individual managers. Now, authorities, when they invest in capacity building of staff, they are enabling their staff, but it so happened that the manager, the official, they are transferred from that area. So now many forest departments, they are focusing on trust building exercises with people. Not only local communities, but media also. There are success stories coming from Maharashtra, from Uttarakhand, where media has become an ally to forest department in conserving wildlife and in generating or in circulating positive stories. So capacity building could also be done for NGOs, for local leaders and panchayat representatives who can then work with the greater target audience. Then when you assess the conflict, not only the biological part, not only the wildlife aspect, but the cultural, historical part, the socio-economic part. Now, in case of West Bengal, in North Bengal, there were the ethnicity of people differentiated who were affected due to elephant and leopard conflict, and tribal communities who tend to have a cultural component, some tolerance, cultural tolerance toward these species, they had less negative attitude towards wildlife, while laborers or migrants who had come from outside, they were more negative towards the wildlife. So all these, so when you are taking any management decision, so you need to put all these things into consideration. And one very important aspect of human wildlife conflict mitigation is a holistic approach and coordination, not only within forest department, but between the forest department and administration. Because crowd management, there are incidents where forest department is trying to catch an animal which has ventured inside the human settlement, but then there are hundreds and thousands of people. So crowd management is an important aspect, but it's not in forest department's hand. So now government is focusing on building those relationships with between the forest department and police, and informing them, ensuring that when an emergency situation arises, people come together and work together as one single unit. Now, one very important aspect of human dimension is park people interface. So for a very long time, like hundreds of years, people have extracted resources from natural system, and if government declare a protected area in that region, that limit, so then some restrictions are imposed. Free grazing might not be allowed. Like in case of national parks and all, there are more restrictions. People cannot cut trees. They can collect firewood, which is dried twigs and branches, and obviously hunting is completely banned. So, but many times alternatives are not provided. People have their dependency, that dependency is there, but now that the source of resources is gone or maybe limited, then people tend to go for illegal ways to get all these resources. Thus there is a conflict between PA staff and local people. So that earlier, the traditional garden guard method has not been very successful. So again, now there are forest department authorities across country. They are working on trust building exercises with people, where people are involved in conservation of resources, or they are provided an alternative resource, or they are provided alternative ways of economic, alternative ways of income generation. So if you look at the protected areas, the national park, sanctuaries, and conservation and community reserves, that form only 5% of India's geographical area. And we have almost 23% of our area is like 5 times of the protected area. We have forest, which is managed either by government or which is managed by communities. In case of Northeast Indian state, we have so many forests, like so much proportion is privately owned by people. So there are ways that government is working towards achieving conservation in those areas by involving people. So these not only, though we have problem in protected areas also, but especially those natural systems which are outside this protected area network, they are coupled with numerous problems. There are, the challenges are multidimensional. We have sand mining or riverbed mining issues. Vast stretches are mined for resources. There are many rapid infrastructural development. There are many linear infrastructure, road, highways, railway lines. You must have read news. Elephant is killed due to on a railway line. There is this stretch just before Dehradun where there were so many cases of elephant death on railway tracks. Then, so their forest department, they look for ways, because development is needed, but you need to find a balance between these two end goals, whether we need wildlife conservation and we need economic development. So human dimension talk about understanding both and bringing a balance between these two. So in case of Uttarakhand, this stretch that I'm talking about, there, what they started, they have put these two forest guards for patrolling that area whenever there is and they have their train schedule with them always. So they check if there is an elephant or a herd crossing or near that railway line. They inform the railway station operator, the manager that at that the officer plays in that area, and then they inform him quickly. Then that person informs the railway driver, the train driver, the operator, and they ensure that speed is maintained so that there is no accident or no elephant killing on the railway track. So there are, these site-specific actions, these small actions that are contributing to conservation and bringing the negative to the development. There was this study where they have come up with suggestions or recommendations to ensure that wherever there is a development project, there are certain mitigative measures to ensure that wildlife also have, wildlife concerns are also taken care of. Now this is, I apologize for this bad picture. It looks, too cluttered sort of, but if you just pay attention to the colors, on our left top, we have Rajaji Tiger Reserve, and on our right bottom, we have Corbett Tiger Reserve. So earlier, there used to be a contiguous forest between these two protected areas, but the urban settlements in that area, the town and rural settlement along these tiger reserves, they have, encroached into natural areas. In last 5 decades, the forest has shrunk between these two tiger reserves, and the corridor has narrowed very much. So now this is the situation in many parts of our country where you have huge landscape, contiguous wildlife habitat, and large-bodied animals such as tiger, elephant, leopards, bear, and all. They used to move from one area to another uninterrupted. But now we have human settlements in those areas. We have, we have very narrow strips of forest left as corridors between these areas. So this is one big management challenge for our country, to ensure that corridors are maintained so that animals can move freely between these wildlife habitats, and less conflict situation arise due to development actions. Now, one of the solutions for various problems in the wildlife conservation is eco-development. Now, in case of eco-development, you talk about community development and ecological development together. Now, it's a site-specific specific package. You can't have, like, our country is so diverse, so you can't have that one solution for all the problems. So it's a site specific package where you try to understand the situation on ground, and measures are taken to promote a healthy and positive interaction between management and people. Now it talks about partnership of government, communities, indigenous people, NGOs, and private sector. And it aims at reduction of conflict, the two-way conflict, whether it's between, how people impact park or how park impact people negatively. So it talks about reduction of that kind of conflict. It talks about broadening the support from people. It brings benefit from non-consumptive use of resources. It could be ecotourism. It could be some some handicraft items that are sold to tourists. Then there is payment from ecosystem service. First, valuation of those services and payment, whether people are willing to pay a price for using some resources, or whether people are willing to accept a price for not using a resource. All those decisions are taken. Then conservation is mainstreamed into development. So not only consumptive values, there are religious or cultural value of all these natural systems. So this is a map of Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary. I've worked in Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary for almost 5-6 years now on different aspects. So in case of Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary, we have 5 Shiva temples, and they are like they are highly revered among Hindu pilgrims, and 3 of these temples are inside the sanctuary. One, Kedarnath, is just outside, but the major part of track goes along the inside the sanctuary, and then the 5th one is just outside the sanctuary boundary. Now, if you look at the Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary, there are almost 172 villages along the sanctuary, and 12 villages are inside the sanctuary. I worked in 2 central valleys where 5 villages are located inside the sanctuary. Now, when people have a free resource in their backyard, they tend to extract resources. So now when you talk about the cultural values, you have to find a balance between conservation and the pilgrimage, because like in case of Kedarnath, there was this study that looked into impact of helicopters, because they tend to fly at lower height on wildlife, whether they were affecting wildlife population along that route. And they found there was some negative impact on the wildlife species. They, along the route, they had stopped using those habitats. So that is like one management issue. But then there are the conservation ethics, which are there due to this religious belief. In many parts of our country, in Western Ghats, in Northeast India, we have sacred groves. In Uttarakhand also, we have sacred groves where a forest patch is devoted or dedicated to the local deity, and people do not use any resource. They do not extract any resource from that forest. In many places, such forests are also a source of water supply. So, the streams are generated. So through these ways, they protect these forests, and these many sacred groves in our country are also home to endemic species. They are, they are very important for conservation of many endemic plant species. Another major solution is ecotourism. Now, in many parts in Himalaya, where the authorities are working with few communities, and they are encouraging travel to these areas to appreciate the cultural and natural values, to ensure that the integrity of ecosystem is not disturbed. Now, it creates economic opportunity to make conservation and protection of natural resources advantageous to local people. Now, one very important aspect of ecotourism is to ensure that there is no leakage of benefit. In many, like in case of Himalaya, there are so many outsider travel agencies and all, which reap tourism. So now authorities, they try to ensure that the local communities, they benefit from tourism and there is no negative impact on the resources, on the ecosystem. Now, when we talk about cultural aspect, one negative impact could be due to tourism, but there is another negative impact that one can see, like in case of rhesus macaque species, which has been very successful living within the human settlement or within the human use areas. Now, because there is this easy provisioning of food, whether food is offered to them or whether they snatch food, or they hunt in the waste, garbage or dumping areas and all. Rhesus macaque have been very successful living next to humans. There are incidents of crop raiding. There are, in case of Himalaya, these areas where the species was not a problem earlier, they are causing so much damage to the crop, and for the marginal society, for the people who have very small land or they don't have alternative source of income, for them rhesus macaque has become a very huge issue. In my case, like I surveyed almost more than 400 households, and 80% of them said that rhesus macaque is one of the biggest problem for them when it comes to sustaining agriculture. There are stories from Uttarakhand where people are leaving their agriculture field. They are migrating outside the village to earn some living because of human wildlife conflict arising due to rhesus macaque and wild pig. So there is a need to understand that all these cultural values might lead to some conflict and might have future consequences. Now then, there is this story, between snow leopard and Himalayan wolves. So in areas where these species overlap, there are incident of livestock depredation by both the species. But most of the time, people persecute Himalayan wolves and they don't persecute snow leopard because snow leopard tend to have a higher cultural value for them, higher conservation value associated with their cultural and tradition. So all these aspects also lead to conflict or might have a negative consequence whether for human or for the wildlife species. Then another very important aspect is integrating gender into conservation projects. Now, if you look in the mountain ecosystem, women have primary responsibility of the management of natural resource base, and they are also custodians of indigenous knowledge. Now, I have worked with women in case of Himalaya, and there they are responsible for collecting resources. They might be running few small natural resource based enterprises. They take care of agriculture, they take care of livestock rearing, because those integrated livelihood systems are dependent on natural resources on forests. They tend to have a very good knowledge of resources or about forests or various processes. They understand that healthy forest and grazing land with firm tenure or user rights will provide them and their children with a secure future. But at times, they are not involved in various conservation projects. So in case of Uttarakhand, for example, they have Gram Panchayat or Van Panchayat. It's a local institution, local body, where they take care of community managed forest. Now, I used to attend those meetings, and once I asked that why women are not allowed in such meetings in higher numbers, so they said that because they have this perception, they have these notions that women, they just make noise, they don't know, they understand the system well, so they are not involved in decision making process, but they are the ones who are carrying activities. For example, there are women welfare groups. They ensure that resources are extracted in regulated manner. They ensure that the social capital that people are known for, the hill communities are known for, is maintained. And they are very important allies to conservation initiatives. And now government or authorities are understanding that. So there are self-help groups promoted by various agencies, including block development offices, and they provide opportunity to these women to earn a living while ensuring that they work for the natural systems also. So if you see the historical role that women have played with in conservation of habitats or forests, we all know about Chipko movement, which that was there in Garhwal, Uttarakhand, in Chamoli district in 1973, and it was led by Gaura Devi, and it was a collective mobilization of women for the cause of preserving forests. So when the contractor, the laborers for a contractor came to cut their forests, and men of the village, they had gone for some meeting out, they were not there. So women decided to protect their forests. They hugged the tree and they stood against the axis of those contractors. But then there's another story for Bishnoi, the first known this non-violent agitation or Chipko movement in the history is from Rajasthan, where in 18th century, there was a lady named Amrita Devi that she laid down they all laid down their lives while protecting trees which were being cut on the orders of the king. So when king saw all that, he saw that people have given their lives while protecting forests. He passed this decree that no trees will be cut in and around Bishnoi villages. So women have played an important role, and they have been playing an important role in conserving forest in our country. So what can be done? So one is catch them young. Younger generation, they learn faster. And whether you want to teach them the destructive resource extraction or conservation, it's up to in our hand. And we should encourage them to take up jobs as teachers and medical personnel. So this I'm saying because when I worked in Himalaya, I used to go to forest with these women, with these young girls, and once we tend to have this discussion on their future. And one of the girls, she told me that here, when we think about our future, we have only one option. Like for boys, they want to join army, and girls, they want to marry a person who is in army. So it's like, it's more like they don't understand, or maybe they are not aware that what options they can have if they are better educated. So if, and I also attended all these meetings of local forest governing bodies, women welfare groups, and their young women were not there. So when I asked people, when I asked the members there, and they would say, oh no, girls, they are not interested, they don't come. So they don't understand all those values. And when they have to extract resources, their actions might be destructive. So it's very important that we involve youth and young girls in conservation. Then there are women welfare and self-help groups which are being promoted by both government and civil society organizations. And then one very important aspect is making them empowered through income generation and through improving their livelihood opportunities. So I talked about local institutions, and they are very important ally in conservation for government bodies. We have Gram Panchayat, we have village panchayat, forest councils. There are women and youth self-help groups. Well, and then in many parts of country, in Northeast India in particular, large stretch of forest is owned by privately owned, is owned by community, and government has understood and government is understanding their role. So we have higher number of conservation reserves where people, where resource extraction is there, but area is conserved and people are made a part of that conservation process. There are acts now. Recently in 2006, there was Forest Rights Act, where the rights of people were understood, and it was ensured that the benefit that they receive from from the natural system is maintained, so that there is no negative or there is no alienation of these community from these system where they had been living for generations. Then there are, many corporations by state government. There is one successful example of Girijan Cooperative Corporation in Andhra Pradesh, where tribal communities are encouraged, provided opportunities to gain livelihood with sustainable resource extraction from forest. Now I have come towards very last of my presentation, and I will share some success stories. One is of greater adjutant from Assam. This bird is one of the most, threatened stock species, and the species has seen a massive decline of its population across countries in South. And now we have breeding population only in India and Cambodia. So there is this project, which is community-based conservation project in Kamrup district of Assam. It is led by Ms. Purnima Devi, and it's funded under Conservation Leadership Program. So they surveyed the feeding habitat, foraging ecology, and nesting tree surveys were conducted. So along with that ecological aspect, they also worked with communities. They conducted awareness campaigns with youth, with village leaders. They felicitated families who were conserving nesting trees of this species. They involved students from a girls' college in field work. And the result was that the youth of area, they have set up a club named Hadgila Conservation Group. Now, Hadgila is local name for the bird in that area. Women, they started weaving the motifs related to birds in their local handcraft. They have this gamcha, this piece of clothes, towel-like clothes, where they sell those, gamchas to tourists and earn money. Then the community have decided to celebrate Hadgila Divas on Wetland Day, World Wetland Day on 2nd February, to spread the message of conservation. Now, this is a success story where people are, where people have gained, and also people have gained from the conservation efforts, and also the species is being protected with people's effort. Now, another example is Elephant Information Network. It's from Annamalai and Valparai Hills. They're a scientist, Dr. Ananda Kumar from Nature Conservation Foundation. He has been working for over a decade now on elephant conflict issues in that landscape, and they have generated this information network where text alerts are sent to people whenever an elephant is spotted. So people are informed within a few kilometers of elephant spotting, and elephant location are also broadcasted on local TV stations. So the average number of attacks on humans and property damage has reduced to a greater extent due to this information network. Lastly, this was an effort that I did under my RUFOD project, where we generally, in case of plantation drives, but forest department, they or other authorities, they conduct plantation drives in the community land or common land. And so I decided to work with people directly, and we did plantation of around 700 saplings, where each family was given a willing family was given few saplings to plant in their agroforestry system. And similarly, school students were given few plant saplings, which were owned by them, the tree is owned by them sort of way. And we saw almost 90% saplings were successfully planted, established within 2-3 years. Like generally after the plantation drive in that area, the result was like 50% or 60% success rate, but we saw 90% success rate. So it was a very small effort within a village. And if you want to contribute, you don't have to think big. You have to start somewhere. You have to start small, and it will lead to conservation eventually. So thank you very much. And if anybody have any questions, like later on, if you want to work on similar aspects or you have any questions, you can write to me. My email is there. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. There are a few questions. The first question is, what is your opinion on wildlife declared as vermin due to public pressure in some states?
It's a very, okay. So because I've been working on human wildlife conflict like this, my current project, I have heard so many experts on this issue, and I have seen also, I would say that, there are certain species like rhesus macaque or wild pig. So this, my view could be very conflicting also, but in my opinion, people could be allowed to kill certain species in certain degree. It's not, it's not that a species should be allowed to kill everywhere. But then when a species is declared vermin, there are some clauses attached to it. For example, you can kill wild pig only if it's there in your agriculture field. But then people are not allowed to consume. So the decision is there, the order is there, but it's not very successful, at least in case of Uttarakhand, because people are not allowed to consume that animal. There are, some certain ways how you can dispose of the body, and people don't want to take that pain. And also in case of rhesus macaque, it has religious value attached to it, so people don't want to kill animal. So but how, like personally, when I have heard so many experts talk about the issues that they have faced in ensuring that the carrying capacity has not went beyond, the population has not went beyond the carrying capacity of a system, then it becomes important that the population of certain species is regulated. So I am in favor, but I wouldn't say that it should be allowed uninterrupted or unregulated. There should be some restrictions. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, ma'am, thank you. The next question is, can you please tell about the measures taken to protect animals from natural calamities? Measures taken to protect animals from natural calamities.
Yes. So I personally have never worked, on this aspect, but what I have read or I have seen people working, for example, in case of Assam, whenever there is this, there is flood in Brahmaputra, so many animals are killed in flood, tigers, rhinos. So naturally, all these natural calamities, they are like they are like a check to the population. However, because these species are threatened now, so there are efforts. For example, in case of Assam, one of my friends, he's a veterinarian there. They rescue all these calves or animals which are affected due to flood, and they ensure that they are treated and then they are released back. So I think those I know of only that effort. The health aspect, the wildlife health aspect of it, but I don't know of any effort that has been done anywhere, because personally I've never worked on that aspect.
Okay, ma'am. The last question is, what according to you do women scientists face in field studies? What are the difficulties or problems you face in field studies?
Okay, there are many, many difficulties, but then there are difficulties there in all the fields, I think, like in case of army also, medical professional also. Being a woman, I think there are issues. So in my case, there have been incidents when people have not taken me seriously. Maybe somebody with equal qualification, if a guy is speaking, they would listen to him. So that is one. But with time, when you build that relationship, when people understand that, oh yeah, you are serious about it, and people tend to respect you or listen to you more. That is one. There have been incidents, not luckily, fortunately, not with me, but with a few of my colleagues, where women have been kind of attacked, not, sort of molested or something, because of that mentality where they don't want to listen anything from a woman. So those issues are also there, but those are very, very few. I know more than 100 women working in this field, and I know of only 2 incidents. So that is not very common, but it's there. But then there is one benefit. If you're working with people, then being women has its own benefit, because they tend to trust you more. And my colleagues, even like my male colleagues, they have said that it's easier for you to talk to people, because then you are welcome more. So that is an advantage also. So other than that, I can't think of any issue, because I have traveled for almost 10 years now. I've been traveling alone, and in Uttarakhand, in some part of Andhra. I have friends who are working in Andhra Pradesh. I have friends who are working in Northeast India, in Western Ghats. So it's not common. The problems are not like, it's not that there are too many problems, but problems are there. But eventually, you have to be more careful. If I'm traveling alone in a city, or if I'm traveling alone in field, I have to be careful at both the places. So situation are similar. There are no specific problems of working in this field, other than that people tend to be biased when you are a woman. That is the main thing, I think.
Ma'am, one last question. Are there any avenues open for youngsters to be involved? Are there any avenues open for youngsters to be involved? Are there any avenues open for youngsters to be involved? Yes, ma'am. Hello. I think there's some connectivity issues there. Thank you, Dr. Upma Mandral, for that wonderful session. We are extremely grateful to you for sharing your precious time, experience, and the knowledge. I would now welcome the second speaker of the day, Ms. Alolika Sinha. Alolika Sinha is a conservation biologist working with a non-profit, non-government organization called Aryanyak, based in Assam, India. For her doctoral thesis, she had studied habitat ecology of hog deer and endangered species in Manas National Park. She is a member of IUCN SSC Deer Specialist Group. Her work largely focuses on conservation research on grassland ecosystems and its dependent fauna so as to aid in making informed conservation decisions. Over her conservation career of approximately 10 years, she has received many grants from various leading donors. To name a few, Conservation Leadership Program, INLAC's Ravi Shankaran Fellowship Program, Small Grants, Ruford Small Grants, Ocean Park Conservation Foundation, Hong Kong. She has received a fellowship to attend the course, Advanced Field Course on Ecology and Conservation Biology in China, and also she's a recipient of travel grants for presenting her work in international conferences. Her job responsibilities at Aryanyak includes leading conservation projects, fundraising, capacity building, and writing reports. She is one of the executive members and holds the position of publicity secretary at Aryanyak. A warm welcome to Ms. Alolika Sinha.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
A very good afternoon to you and all the respected faculty members present here and students. And thank you for the introduction, Sangeeta ma'am. So may I just start straight away, or like
Yes, ma'am. You can start. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, just a second. Just give me a second. I'll share my screen. In the meanwhile, here in Assam, we are celebrating, not actually, like we're observing the Durga Puja. So sending you good wishes from Assam to all of the participants.
Thank you.
Is my screen visible? Is my screen visible, madam?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, it's visible.
And just for my own understanding, what is my target group? Are they all BSc students?
No, you have faculty members, research scholars, and students.
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah. Shall I begin now? So today I will be talking about the title of my presentation is Aliens in My Forest and Mitigating the Crisis. Well, by aliens here, I do not mean any aliens coming from a different planet, but it's the aliens in a biological context coming from different countries. So when I talk about aliens throughout my presentation, I talk about this. Is my pointer visible to all of you? Is my pointer visible to all of you? I'm focusing on a picture here, if I may.
Yes, ma'am, it's visible.
The pointer, okay. So on the right hand side of the slide, you see a picture with this white flowers. So these are my aliens. And on the background, you see a lush green patch of grassland. So that would have been the ideal habitat in absence of these aliens. So throughout my presentation, I will be taking you through like what I mean by the aliens, why they are important or unimportant, and how are we, this has been definitely a threat, and how we are mitigating the crisis. So from the last, I'm not sure whether my slides are working. Did you see my slides change? I cannot see anything on my screen here.
No, it's not changing, ma'am. We can see the first slide.
Just a second. There is some issue that now.
No, it's still the same. The first slide, aliens in my forest.
I'll stop sharing for a while and I'll redo it. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Is it working now? Yeah, I think it's working now, right?
Yeah, we can. Yes, ma'am. We can see the slides.
It's working.
It's working, right? Okay, so this is the problem with the tech online thing. You're never sure of what is going on. Okay, coming to what aliens are. So by aliens, what I mean is an alien species which has been introduced to a certain ecosystem from somewhere else. In our cases, it's mostly from other countries. And these alien species are not very beneficial. Rather, they can cause environmental, economic, and human health hazards. And given this has been considered by the CBD as one of the second biggest threats to the native biodiversity just after the habitat destruction. So today, through my presentation, I will be focusing mostly on the alien invasive plants. And there was a study which listed some 100 most invasive plants. And unfortunately, in India, we have 11 of them occurring in different agricultural landscape and protected areas. So these invasive plants, they not only impact the local biodiversity, the local wildlife, but also threatens the food security through impacting the agricultural landscape. Obviously, so with this havoc being caused by the invasive species, it has been a conservation priority. Having said that, here you can see a map. So the green portion you can see, the green strip here, it's called the Tarai region. So basically the Tarai region are the sub-Himalayan grasslands that extends from the northwestern Uttar Pradesh all the way to the eastern part of or to the northeast India, covering from Nepal and Bhutan. These are one of the tallest and one of the most productive habitats, the grassland ecosystem, and it's an important habitat because it supports high biomass, and also it supports many important grassland species such as the rhinoceros, the hog deer, the Bengal florican, and the very rarest of rare Swedes, the pygmy hawk. Why I mention about these grasslands? Because I have to answer my questions that I will be explaining in a while, I have chosen this ecosystem as my study site. From the last presentation, Upma has taken you to the Western Ghats, to the Northeast India. So I will be narrowing it down to Northeast India, and most importantly to the Manas National Park. So just to give you a glimpse of what a typical Tarai ecosystem looks like, this is a typical Tarai ecosystem presented here through 4 photographs. So you on the leftmost corner, you can see that's a grassland habitat with some wetland where you can see rhinos swimming around. The adjacent photograph speaks of a hog deer, which is one of my study models in the grassland habitat. In the right-handmost corner, you can I have shared this picture to give you an idea that how tall the grasses really are. You can see the elephants almost immersed in the grassland. So these are tall grassland. It can reach up to 6 meters of height, and those are really dense grasslands. But these grasslands have their own problem because these grasslands grow in the sub-Himalayan landscape along the Gangetic and the Brahmaputra flatlands. They are also very fertile. Given its fertility, most of these grasslands are being converted for agricultural use. There is a lot of most of the grasslands are now confined only to the protected areas like the Manas National Park, the Dudhwa National Park in Uttar Pradesh. Otherwise, the grasslands from the non-protected areas has been encroached for agricultural practices. Now, coming to the Northeast India, where I focused my study, Manas National Park in Assam is one such landscape, which is the last remnant of this Tarai in India. So the Indian Tarai, we also have, the Tarai landscape is in the transboundary, we have Tarai landscape even in the Nepal and Bhutan and also in India. So in the Indian Tarai, we have divided the Tarai region into Western and the Eastern India. Manas National Park is one of the protected areas which has potential Tarai grasslands in the Eastern Tarai region. And I chose Manas as my study site because of a number of reasons. One of them being Manas is a conservation hotspot. In Manas, if you see the picture on the right-hand side corner, the lighter green portion are the grasslands and the darker green portion are the woodlands. Manas is one such place which has a number of species that are grassland dependent and very rare, which are not found elsewhere, like the critically endangered pygmy hawk, the Bengal florican, which is a very restricted distribution in Northeast India and Cambodia, the hog deers, the one-horned rhinoceros, the swamp deer. So for a person who wants to work on grasslands and its species, Manas is the hub. And also this beautiful and very important conservation landscape has experienced armed conflicts. So from the mid-90s to 2003, there were insurgency problems, and due to this, most of the wildlife population declined. There were the habitat destruction occurs, and also there were a complete collapse of the law and order situation. Because of this, we have lost a very prime wildlife, prime wildlife habitat, and also most of the wildlife population because of this rampant hunting and everything. So when in 2003 things were getting better with the signing of the Boreland Territorial Council Accord, so there were conservation efforts invested to secure this landscape and also to revive the park. But again, when it comes to habitat, like in India, most of the conservation attention are drawn by the big species like the elephants, the tigers, and the rhinos. Not many people talk about the habitats or the lesser known species. But then Manas was always a heaven for all these beautiful grassland species like the pygmy hawk and hog deer. And also, like an animal can do well only when you have a good habitat, good resources. habitat is one such resource that can keep going the animals, and also it can ensure into long-term conservation. So when I talked about alien plants in my first slide, so the earlier studies have indicated that the grasslands of Manas has been invaded by many species. But again, since the conservation attention was mostly focused on the big faunal species, this was never been taken into account, and it received very little attention. So in 2013, what we did, we started a long-term study. It was like a year-round study at that point of time, but over the years, given the importance and the threats it poses, we continued to study, and we're still continuing 7 years down the line. So I have divided my presentation into these following layers. Firstly, I will be answering like what alien species occurs in Manas and what is the current status of this alien species. Secondly, how these invasive species are influencing the animals there, and for that I have chosen hog deer as a model, as I mentioned earlier. And then coming to this, like if it has got problem, then how do we prevent it? So I'll take you to the first part of my research question. So we wanted to know, where are these alien invasive plants in Manas? And to answer these questions, what you need is a proper survey, a systematic survey. So we, if you are aware of the grid concept in a satellite process, satellite imagery of the Manas National Park, we laid grids, that is squares of 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer to categorize the area, and then we did surveys in those grids. Like grid-based approach is a common approach in wildlife studies. So it makes for you to easier for you to study. So in each grid, what we did, we either walked, or in the tall dense grasslands when it was difficult to walk, what we did, we used elephants, the camp elephants, and we surveyed from the elephant back, and we estimated the abundance of the invasive species. Where we have put, it was a visual ocular estimation. We divided our abundance in a circular plots of a varied diameter, which of one class was of 1 to 3 meter, the next was of 3.5 to 5 meter, and so on, and the largest plot was of more than 50 meter radius. So, and that's how we measured the abundance of the invasive plants. And after collecting the field data, we used a technique called Maxent, another very popular habitat suitability modeling technique being adopted nowadays to understand to predict the invasive plants based on the presence location. So after conducting all these surveys and doing some statistical analysis, we found that this is the present distribution of the invasive plants in Manas. So in Manas, of that 100 plants listed, we have got 2 invasive plants, the Cromolina odorata and the Mycenia micrantha. And besides this, there were also some other plants, but these 2 were the most abundant. And it was like widespread in the grassland habitat, as you can see from the map here. Sorry, and we estimated that about 30% of the map, about 30% of the habitat is affected by this invasive species, which can lead to a potential habitat shrinkage. And as I mentioned about the Maxent technique, using Maxent, we could find out that the grasslands, you see all the red colors are the probable probability of high presence of the invasive species. The first map shows the probability of the Mycenia infestation, and second one shows the probability of the Cromolina infestation. So you can see that if at the present rate of invasion, if we do not act, the entire grasslands of Manas will be gone. Now coming to this map, in a separate study that was a part of my PhD, we already calculated like what is the present status of the grassland habitat as a whole, like whether it's invaded or not. So you can already see that there's a marked decrease in the grassland habitat from 1988 to the 2019. Like 3 decades ago, most of Manas was covered by grassland habitats. Like the lighter green portion shows you the grassland habitat. And as after 3 decades down the line, you see most of the grassland habitats are gone. It's almost 50% of the original grassland habitats are gone in Manas. This was a part of a different study. I'm showing you here just to draw a context like what the grasslands of Manas are actually facing. We have an inherent problem of grasslands being declined drastically. At the same time, we have the problem that the existing grasslands are invaded by this alien species. So that's the current scenario of the grasslands. As a next part of the question, I wanted to really look into how this alien invasive, we are already clear about the fact that the alien invasive plants are affecting the grassland habitats. Now, what is the impact on the grassland dependent fauna? And I chose hog deer for that. Again, the story of like the reason for choosing hog deer is like hog deer was one of the most abundant ungulates in Manas before the armed conflict that I mentioned previously. During the 80s, early 80s, there were some 10,000 hog deer, but it has come down to few hundreds during this unrest period. And again, the population is now reviving. So I thought that choosing a hog deer would be a good model to understand how these invasive plants are affecting this species. So what I did was I estimated the population density of hog deer, and I tried to investigate like what are the factors that affect its habitat use. And for estimating population, those who are aware of it, like we have a standard protocol of distance sampling protocol where we lay transects. On the left side of the map, you can see all those black lines. Those are my transects in the grasslands. I surveyed these transects in a straight line from the elephant back. From the picture on the right hand side, you can see that. And I noted down the number of hog deers that I have seen, the habitat that it was seen, like within the broader grassland habitats. Someone who is acquainted with the grasslands will know that within a broad grassland habitats, we also have patches of different grass assemblages that makes a micro habitat. Like in this above picture, you can see a grassland dominated by a species called Narenga porphychroma, which is a microhabitat within this broader grassland habitat. In the picture below, you can see that's a combination of Narenga and Saccharum species. So you have different microhabitats. So I really wanted to check like what is the population density of hog deer in Manas, and I did the line transects. I surveyed some 206 kilometers within these grasslands and cited 202 hog deers. From this data, I calculated that the density of hog deer is around 18, which gives you an approximate population of some 3,500 hog deers currently residing in the Manas National Park. For those who are unaware of like how these calculations are made, we have a software called Distance, and you can run the data that you collect from the field, and you get a output something like this. And also using this heat map technique, you can do it in the QGIS. So we have to find out like which areas are mostly used or where are the hog deer population distributed across Manas, and all those bluish green colors shows you the hotspots of hog deer presence in the Manas National Park. I won't go details of these graphs and tables. So in a nutshell, what you can say, the current population of hog deer in Manas is some 3,500, which is low as compared to the one that was found during the early 1980s, but then the population is recovering. As a second part of it, what I really investigated was, I talked about the microhabitat. So we have some 9 categories of habitat dominated by different species of grass. Like the first one is the Imperator dominated grasslands. The second habitat type was Imperator Narenga co-dominance, and we have Phragmites and Saccharum species and so on. So in 9 different habitat categories, I recorded a number of hog deer, and I used index, something called Manley Standardized Index, which is used to measure the habitat preference. And what I got was like the hog deer preferred the habitat with a mosaic of tall and short grasslands. Imperator are really short grasslands, which is with the average height being 1 meter, and the Imperator Narenga height reaches up to 2 to 3 meters. So they prefer the areas which are dominated by Imperator and Imperator Narenga grasslands, because that meets their life requirements of getting available food and also getting enough cover in presence of to escape from the predators. So this is the habitat use pattern of hog deer. Like the hog deer prefer the mosaic of short and tall grasslands. Now coming to like applying another statistical approach called the generalized linear modeling, I tried to figure out what is the impact of different habitat covariates and anthropogenic pressure on the hog deer. And you can see from the graph here, the one in the green color and the other in the blue color. So these are the abundance of the invasive plants and the presence of human disturbance, and these two factors affect the hog deer negatively. That means when the abundance of the invasive species are more, the abundance of the hog deer tends to decrease. Given this, you can understand that the invasive species does have a invasive plant species, the Chromolina mycina, does have a negative influence on the hog deer habitat use. So this tells you, my earlier studies, my earlier two slides tells you that the invasives are not good for the grassland ecosystems and they are not good for the hog deer. So far, we have identified what are the problems that the alien invasives have. They're not good for the grassland ecosystem. They're not good for the grassland dependent species. And also to add to this, if you see the map here on the right hand side, the grasslands in Manas are already has hit their all-time low. Like they have over the 3 decades, it has come down to it has reduced by 50%. And on top of it, the grasslands are such ecosystems, you know, which are regulated by the fluvial action. That means floods and grazing animals do regulate the grassland ecosystem. But in Manas, since it's located in the Bhutan foothills, we don't have regular floods as in Kaziranga or as Upma mentioned earlier as in Brahmaputra. So here the grasslands are not regularly regulated by the flood waters. And also in this landscape, which is tapped between on the northern side by the Bhutan hills and on the southern side by densely populated villages. All these light yellow colors are the villages of the human habitation. So the grasslands are kind of trapped with, it's been sandwiched between the Bhutan hills and the human habitation. And with the present rate of infestation, we have already seen that there are fair chances that the grasslands will be gone. So what do we do now? So far, we have identified all the problems. So after identifying the problems, we could relate to preserve and conserve the grasslands in Manas. We have to come up with very active managing of these grasslands. For those who are unaware, grasslands have always been management dependent. Grasslands are one such ecosystems that are not in the climax vegetation stage. Like you have floods, then siltation happens, new grasses come, they grow, and then that is occupied by the woodlands. So it's always in a successional stage. So in areas where you have grassland, they have been maintained either by flood or by the by creating fire by the forest department. So the grasslands are always management dependent. So in case of Manan, since we do not have flood, the only way left for us is to actively manage the grasslands. And for that, we have to arrest the invasion at any cost. So what we did, we conducted some of the experiments to identify the best way to control the spread of this invasive. Since it's a protected area and there are a lot of animals that depend on these grasslands for their food, we were not allowed to use the herbicides. That would have been cost effective. So what we did, we came up with, after consultation with many grass experts and a lot of scientists, conservationists, what we did, we did an experiment. So this is our experiment design. We came with 4 treatments. One of them was control. The other one was manually uprooting. That means cutting out the uprooting the invasive plants, then cutting from the above ground level and burning it, and only cutting it. So after conducting these experiments for 3 years, what we have found that manual uprooting of the invasive plants from the degraded area had the best result. over the 3 years, you see the abundance of the invasive plants have decreased. If you see the graph on the right hand side, so it has decreased, and manual uprooting was considered as one of the best methods to control the spread of invasives. So, and again, also it has an added advantage, as Upma mentioned in her earlier presentation, that how important it is to integrate the human dimension into wildlife conservation. While doing this manual uprooting, what we did is we hired people from the fringe areas of the park with a dual intention: firstly, to restore the habitat, and secondly, to make them aware of the habitat restoration process and how maintaining these grasslands are important for the survival of the species. So at the end of 3 years, we have this. If you look around on the leftmost corner, we have this plot, this grassland, the fencing you see, that's the boundary of the Manas National Park. So entire habitat is degraded. There are no patches of grasslands here, but it's only the Cromolina plants. We selected this area. In the next phase, we collected data like what is the abundance of the invasive plants there, whether this plot is being used by the animals or not, and all those kind of ecological data. Then we hired these local villagers, and they uprooted the plants from the ground level. And at the end of 3 years, we had this. So if you see the leftmost photo and the rightmost photo, you can easily compare that from a very degraded Cromolina infested patch of habitat has been completely restored. And now we have this native grass species here. So the grass you can see here are the saccharum. We have saccharum grasses, we have imperata, and we have this naringa. It's again a time consuming process. It was not achieved at the day one. After 3 years of the treatment, we came up with this condition. The experiments were carried out in plots of 1 hectare area. And since we successfully demonstrated that we could, through our continued efforts, we could restore these habitats. So in the latter years, we have expanded our work. And so far in the Manas National Park, we have restored some 5 square kilometer of 5 square kilometer of area. So the takeaway message from this presentation is to achieve something meaningful, you first have to have the baseline data, what we did by collecting the distribution pattern of the invasive plants in Manas, and then coming up with all those fancy maps, and so to aid and make informed conservation decisions. And then we studied that how animal or faunal species can be affected by these invasive plants, whether they have a positive impact or whether they have a negative impact. And we did find that it does have a negative impact on the animals. And having had these baselines of the threat being posed by the alien invasive plants, we came up with we tried to find ways to prevent this invasion and come up with something that we could help the managers with. So our experiments in that case has helped with the managers, and with the success of this work, a consortium was formed, and the Manas authorities were really keen on our restoration method, and now it has been institutionalized. And now we are developing an action plan so that informed conservation decisions can be made. So with this, I end my presentation, and I have kept my presentation really short because I was not and kept it very non-technical. People who would like to have more questions on the technical part, like how I did the line transects or the statistical modeling thing, I would love to answer them. You can have my email ID and you can ask me whenever you want. And I've kept the presentation really short so that I can have a lot of interaction with you. So thank you. Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. So I just wrapped up my presentation, and it's over to you and the participants if they have any questions.
There are two questions, ma'am. What parameters were factored in Maxent to predict the spread of invasive plants, and the prediction is for what timeline?
Okay. So I assume that someone who has asked this question already have a basic knowledge of what Maxent is. So what we have
one of the participants has asked the question.
Yeah. So we have used all the ecogeographical parameters and the environmental parameters, and we have found that the precipitation and precipitation play a major role in in the invasion, and also other drivers of this invasion were any sort of openings, like when we have a road coming in middle of the grasslands, or some camp being constructed, when any clearing like added fueled the abundance of these invasive plants. So I think I can read in the chat in South London.
Okay, there's one more question, ma'am. Do these invasive species assume any ecologically positive roles, like pollination service or being used by locals for any purpose? In South, lantana is used to make furniture because these invasives cannot be completely eradicated, but regulated.
Yeah, right. I would love to answer that question. Actually, those are the real conservation problems that we face. So answering the first part of the question, do these invasive species assumed any ecologically positive roles? Well, it might have some ecological positive roles, but you know, it's all about the negative roles being played by this invasive has outweighed the positive roles. So even if it's for us in the Manas landscape, what we have found that it has completely smothered the native grass species. As you can see from the picture which I have shared earlier, the entire grass patch was wiped out because of this, smothered out because of this the proliferation of this invasive species. So in our case, it was mostly the negative impact that we have. But having said this, you know, all the invasive species, they have their different functional role to play. They have different physiology. So I cannot generalize the thing. But yes, for us, Chromolina and Mycenia were not doing any good for the environment, for the ecosystem. And the second part of the question is about lantana. Yes, the lantana is used to make the furniture, because lantana is the sturdier one. It can hold weight. For us, we don't have much of a lantana. What we have is the Chromolina, and Chromolina has a dyeing property, you know, the natural dye. We are also experimenting with that. We are trying to use this Chromolina. We have been successful, like experimentally, we have been successful, but we haven't tried that at a commercial scale. Regular gives this Chromolina gives you a nice tinge of off-white. If you heard of the muga silk in Assam, so it gives you a light muga color. It's a light off-white or cream color, whatever you say. It has that dyeing property, and we have also tested it as a insecticide. That's being experimented. We cannot conclusively say anything on this, but we are trying out these different ways so that people can use this Chromolina that comes out of the forest and put in some commercial use. But by saying that, we do not encourage growing of the Chromolinas. The Chromolinas being used for all these different experiments are the waste products from the uprooting process. We do not encourage growing of Chromolinas to do all these things. Yeah. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. We are indebted to you for being a part of our webinar. On behalf of Department of Zoology and the Nature Club of Indian Academy Degree College Autonomous, I extend my heartfelt thanks to the guest speakers of today, Dr. Uppa Mandal and Ms. Alolika Sinha. It was an honor to have had someone of your professional expertise and credentials as our resource person. Thank you so much. I also thank all the participants for your active and warm participation. I would like to tell you that the feedback link for today's webinar will be posted in the chat box. The last session, the third session of this webinar series will be scheduled on 31st of October at 2 p.m. Kindly participate in the last session too. You can fill the feedback form which is posted in the chat box. Thank you, everyone.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
If time permits, there are 2 questions in the chat box I would like to answer if there is a time, of course.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So someone mentioned about soil seed bank. He is Ramesh. Okay. So Ramesh, while restoring, what we're also doing is we are supplementing the restoration with plantation of native grass species so that we can take care of the seed bank thing. And also we try to uproot the invasive plants just before the flowering. So we don't have much of seeds being spread after the flowering. So that's how we address the soil thing. And someone mentioned about forest plants. Yes, both the Cromolina and Mycenia are being seen to reduce the forage availability. And that's how, I talked about the hog deer thing. So that's how it negatively affects the hog deer by reducing the forage availability. So thank you. That's all I wanted to mention. And if anyone has question, I'm just typing my email ID. I would love to hear from you people, and it's always been a pleasure to talk to students.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for sharing your precious time and resourceful knowledge with our participants.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Hope you can see the feedback link is posted in the chat box. Kindly fill the feedback form. Dr. Upma,
Excuse me, Mary, ma'am.
yes, ma'am.
Is it good to leave the webinar?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. You can leave the meeting. Dr. Upma wanted to answer one more question. I'm just trying to reach her.
Okay.
She wanted to answer one more question for her session.
Okay. So is the question specific to her session or is a general question?
First, it's related to her subject, ma'am.
Oh, okay, sure. So, meanwhile, I would also like to say, like, I heard someone asking about what are the opportunities for the youngsters.
Yes, ma'am. That was the question.
Oh, So before, like if Upma hasn't joined yet, I would like to answer that, there are a lot of opportunities for the youngster at the present time. Like practicing conservation, I think people people often ask me why you do not practice conservation, and the answer to this that comes in my mind is, why shouldn't we? Like traditionally the Indians has been conserving nature. Upma has cited few examples from the Chipko movement and from the Bishnoi community and all. So traditionally we have been doing this. Somehow with urbanization and the development, those took a backseat for a while, but I think with the young people coming forward, and with all this Discovery and National Geography playing a big role to introduce wildlife to the common people, and with lot of issues now, there are a lot more avenues and opportunities for the young students. To begin with, I would say what you can do, you can do small volunteering or internship programs with the leading research institutes or the conservation organizations to learn from. It's very important to equip yourself with the knowledge and the experience that you gain through the years, and practice conservation. It's not a, it doesn't come with a certificate and a degree always. You can always be a conservation without having a formal degree on conservation, right? So start with small things. Start with observing the wildlife in your backyard, like the birds. Start practicing small things like reducing and reusing things. So all those little things, add to this experience. And if you want to start professionally, start doing this volunteering and the internship. That helps a lot. I like for my master's, I did my internship with this organization that I'm working with now, RNMEC. I did my internship there. Then I started off with the projects. I'm being selected as one of the EC members now. So it all starts with very small steps. So I would encourage all of you to look forward to these opportunities. And there are a lot of things being posted on the internet nowadays. So yeah, there are a lot of opportunities.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm just using the time when I'm waiting. I'm also waiting for Upma. So if she's not here.
Thank you so much.
I think Upma has written.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, Upma is back.
Yeah, no, actually, yeah, I was there as a participant, so that's why I couldn't unmute my mic. Alolika has already answered the question, I think.
I'm sorry, Upma.
No, that's fine. That's fine. That's perfectly fine. Actually, I would have said similar things only. The only thing is I didn't do any internship, but when I was during my master days, I used to go for bird watching. There was this bird watching group. So now for today's generation, things are a little easier. There is social media. There are groups, local groups. They, have an open mind. At times, I have seen people saying that I just want to work on elephants or I want to work only on birds. Have an open mind, because this is the time when you can learn things. Maybe when I actually wanted to work on birds, on landscape connectivity of wetlands for my PhD. I even wrote a project. But meanwhile, I got to visit Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary, and I saw that there are so many aspects of working with people, and there was no study as such from that particular area where I did my PhD. So have an open mind, always ask questions, reach out to people. There might be somebody who might not answer to you, but there will be many more who will answer, who will write back. So always, if you want to know things, write to people, join groups, social media, make good use of social media. Follow such groups. There might be bird watching groups. There might be tree spotting groups. If you have any day off, you can always go on such walks with such groups and look for opportunities. I think that is the best that you can do to start early. And as Alolika said, do internship with organization. Know what are the organizations who are working in your area. Okay, when you have to maintain a balance between your studies and such activities. So start early, make good use of social media and all. So I think that is the best to do. And write to people, ask questions. I mean, the worst that can happen is people won't answer, but there will be people who will answer. So reach out to people, ask for help, ask questions. That is very important. Yeah, that's it. I think Alolika has already answered.